And I would like to remind everybody that the only official record of this meeting today would be the one issued by the Public Utilities Commission. And with that, I will turn it over to Steve Silberman to open the meeting.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Morning, everybody. Today's meeting is focusing on a presentation from CenturyLink and Intrado as it relates to the FCC filing or the FCC report and order for NextGen 911. And just to remind everybody, this is our second go round, and we had sent expectations to CenturyLink. And just to review them real quickly in a summary, we're asking for a presentation that focuses on G911 report and order as it relates to the BESP and the ESInet. Also, a clear explanation of phase 1 and phase 2 and the impacts or lack thereof to PSAPs during each phase. And then lastly, as a final request, what work has been done so far for preparing to respond to a valid request for phase 1 implementation. A timeline and when its subcontractor Intrado might be ready to comply with a valid request. And so for that, I'm going to kick it over. Tracy, are you going to lead this, or Steve? Who should I hand off the reins to?
Actually, this is Paul Brown. I'll go ahead and start the conversation off, and then Steve Deloach will come in as well.
Sounds good. Thanks, Paul.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining. To Mr. Silverman's points, what I've done is created a deck that outlines what the FCC order 2478 in G911 is about, how it impacts the both the network, the OSPs, and to what degree, if any, impacts the PSAPs. So let me go ahead and just start by sharing my screen. Let me know if you can see that.
Not yet.
Okay, let's try this.
Paul, it was just up there, Paul. I thought. There we go.
Let's try again.
Yep, there you go.
Now we can see it.
All right, excellent. Overall, if you'll bear with me, what we're going to do is we're going to answer all the questions related to what Steve just outlined in this deck. And if you don't mind, if you could just save your questions till the end, I think we're going to hit on all the marks. So FCC 2478 does break down into two phases, phase 1 and phase 2. Each phase having a period of 6 months from the time that a valid request is submitted. The valid request is submitted by the 911 authority. And as such, when the valid request goes out, that valid request goes out to all OSPs that are operating within the state.
Hey,
Okay.
Paul,
Yeah.
hold on. So this is Steve Deloach. So quick intro. I don't know if you guys know who Paul is, but Paul Brown serves as our regulatory interface. So we kind of asked Paul to jump on the call since he's been heavily involved in the order, and from a Lumen perspective, he is the regulatory interface to anything FCC related. So that's the reason Paul Brown is on the call, kind of communicating from a Lumen perspective how we've interpreted the FCC order 2478 as a BESP. So I just want to kind of set the stage for those that may not know who Paul Brown is.
Thank you very much, Steve. And yeah, I greatly appreciate that. So yeah, again, so what we're looking at here is we're concentrating on phase 1. This is a symmetrical approach, okay? Phase 1 of the report and order centers around OSPs within the state. And it's an effort to have the OSPs migrate their traffic off of their legacy TDM or their trunks away from the current TDM POIs and over to a newly installed IP interface, what they call it, an IP POI. That's the concentration of phase one. Now, Lumen does have the unique position of sitting in as both an OSP and, as you're referencing, a BESP, or a basic emergency service provider. And as such, Lumen as a BESP is prepared to operate and coordinate with the state 911 authority on all these efforts that include guidance if necessary in submitting the valid request. We would also like to enter in as and there'll be a greater detailed discussion about it, but we'd like to invite the 911 authority to allow Lumen as the BESP to operate under an LOA, possibly to help guide the rest of the OSPs in their efforts to move according to the order. And that is under phase one and probably in phase two. Step one would be, again, moving the traffic to a new internet protocol, or I'm sorry, IP point of interconnect or interface, just commonly referred to as an IP POI. Once that location has been determined, we'll communicate that with the 911 authority and work and collaborate with the 911 authority on those locations. Our 911 planning team is currently engaged in the review of all those locations available to us. And we have been ever since the order has been executed. So again, and for those that would like a little drawing, here is the objective of phase one. The objective of phase one is, again, IP POI, standing up those IP POIs and then migrating all the traffic away from the old TDM POIs over to this new IP POI that will then terminate into the BESP core network in partnership with Entrado. So the time frame is 6 months after the receipt of a valid request. No action is required by the PSAPs at this time. Subsequent to that, as I mentioned here, Lumen's already in the planning phases. We're reviewing the network, making sure everything's lined up, and we'll continue to, they're observing across the nation as well. What we're asking next is that the 911 authority submit a valid request. Once that valid request is submitted to the FCC, this should serve as notification to all OSPs. The OSPs will then, they'll have each 6 months to move their traffic. This includes an opportunity for the OSPs to challenge or file an opposition with the 911 authority, and that may stop the clock for them. Doesn't necessarily mean that it will stop, but it may pause any efforts on the OSP's part. But it is allowed by the OSPs to file a petition against that. So step one, again, Lumen will work with the 911 authority to negotiate the location of those IP POIs that will be offered. Step two, the 911 authority will submit an official request notifying the OSP of the move. I provided a link. By the way, I should also mention, I will provide a copy of this deck back to Steve, Jennifer. You'll get a copy of this deck. Here's the link to the FCC webpage for those that are interested. I also provided a copy of the valid request form if you are interested in using that. I took that off the site early this morning, so it's a fresh copy. And Lumen will also, as part of this coordination, Lumen will assign a project manager to coordinate all of this traffic as we move through here. It does take a little bit of time and coordination. We're already working these, some of these valid requests across other parts of the United States. And as an example,
Hey, Paul, let's go back. Let's pause for a minute to see if there's any questions on,
Okay.
and we're calling this the 3-step process to start the phase 1 deployment. And I think what we owe you all in order to get started on step 2 is some locations of proposed in-state POIs. Now, keep in mind the FCC order doesn't specify that the POIs have to be in state. It says it could be in state or out of state. What we're seeing from most customers is that they're asking for the IP POIs to be in state, primarily so that if you got those small mom and pop RLECs that they may not have a national IP footprint or backbone. So by keeping the POIs in state, is less resistance from them being able to get the traffic to those in-state POIs versus out-of-state POIs. We currently have out-of-state POIs already set up that we see a lot of our wireless providers are utilizing those when we migrate to next gen. We've not seen many of the small ILECs, RLECs take their traffic to IP POIs. They've been going to the in-ladder TDM POIs, and I see there's 2 hands up. So we
Yeah.
want to kind of put together this step 1, step 2, step 3 process to kind of simplify what's required to get the process started.
Yes, Steve, we got 2 hands up. Joe Benkert.
First, I think that when we're talking the RLECs, I think they have 12 months from the request to comply, but I don't think that should make any difference here because essentially the delivery of SIP is already set up from CenturyLink from the BESP to the PSAPs.
It's true, but we're asking all the current subtended OSPs that are going through our TDM aggregate to move to the new IP POIs.
Right. In Colorado, we've had, from when we had E911, we had the points of interconnection where at the selective routers, we had 1 in each LATA. We've continued to have 3 interconnection points for delivery, I think from all carriers, but that helped for the rural guys because they're now paying for that transport to the point of interconnection. Do you have a need to go down to 1 or 2 within the state, or would you be able to stay with 3? I know in other states where another provider, core services provider, one bids provide NG911 service, there was a lot of concern about the costs that are being pushed onto the local providers. There were RLECs and what it would do to their costs, and just wondering if there's a need to actually migrate down to 2 or 1 IP point of connection in the state.
Yeah, let me take that. This is Steve Billow.
Okay.
So currently in the state of Colorado, all of our connections into the Lumen infrastructure is via these TDM POIs. So the OSPs have T1s that they build to our TDM POIs, or we're using our selective router as an aggregation point, but the traffic is TDM. The whole intent of the order was to do away with TDM and migrate that traffic to IP. So to answer your question, once the request is generated from the state of Colorado to implement phase 1, then we will start notifying, after we've negotiated with the state where the IP POIs are going to be located, then it becomes the responsibility of those OSPs to migrate that traffic from the Lumen TDM POIs or the Lumen selective routers to these designated IP POIs. That was the whole intent of the FCC order was to do away with TDM and migrate to IP. Hopefully that answered your questions, Joe.
Where do you do the conversion from TDM to IP within the BESP network at this point?
So right now we're doing that function. So we have what we call an LNG, Legacy Network Gateway. So once the provider gets that traffic to our selected routers, then we're providing that LNG function to convert it to IP to get it across the Lumen IP backbone.
Is that function at the selective routers?
It's further out.
It's further out, and so it's not physically at the selective routers. We get that traffic to our LNG locations to do that conversion.
Okay. Because right now all the connections, the TDM connections are,
That's right.
you know, ones that you have to the provider for exchange of all traffic, and you have a meet point. And then that's going to mean they're going to have to build or buy a new facility, I guess, to the IP location.
That's right. Absolutely. And the other thing that, and I know this is why it took that FCC order so long to get implemented. A lot of the smaller mom and pop RLECs, they may have, I would say, a legacy DMS, a legacy IP switch. And in this new world, they have to perform that LNG function to convert that traffic from their if they got a legacy analog switch to IP, where we're kind of doing it on their behalf today to get that traffic on the Lumen IP backbone. So it does put some responsibility back on the OSPs to do something to get that traffic to these IP pores.
Is that a functional responsibility or a cost responsibility where they could pay you to still do that conversion?
I think the way the order is written, it is a functional responsibility, because if they get it, and I don't think right now from a Lumen product perspective, we've not made a decision that we want to continue being in the aggregation business. And here's one of the reasons why, Joe. So today, when we're in the aggregation business, if you have a Lumen point of failure somewhere in the Lumen ingress network, it impacts normally the delivery of traffic in the host state. In this new scenario, because now the individual OSPs are building traffic to the IP pores, if there's an issue, it only impacts that particular OSP because they have trunking network built to these IP pores. So they have an issue, or Lumen has an issue on our network, it only impacts Lumen traffic. Like I said, depending if it's on the ingress side, it would only impact Lumen traffic or the OSP traffic, where today, depending upon where the outage is on the ingress side, it could impact the whole state. So I think that's what, and I will say this, a lot of times what we Lumen did to accelerate the deployment of next generation 911, we said, hey, OSPs, you've already got traffic coming to our selective routers via ES trunks. So we'll do that conversion so that we can accelerate the deployment of next generation to get off of that old infrastructure. What we have seen, and by doing it that way, it may be a year and a half long process before you get the first PSAP live, versus the traditional way is all OSPs have to build traffic to the TDM ports in the designated ladders. And we've seen sometimes that could be years for those OSPs to get infrastructure built to those legacy TDM ports. So hopefully that answers your questions, Joe.
Well, yeah, it is. It just seems
Okay.
if all the RLECs in the state have to build new facilities or acquire new facilities to a separate location, that could take a really long time.
And well, I think if the way the order I think Paul's interpretation, whether it's 6 months or 12 months, they have a time frame from the time the 911 authority notifies them that they want to move to IP POIs to get that traffic. The other thing I would tell you is a lot of this small RLECs, they want to move to IP because the people that were doing all that legacy TDM stuff have since retired. And it's really difficult for them to do anything. So what we're seeing in some other states, those small RLECs, they want to move to IP and get out of the TDM world.
Hey, Steve, we got another hand up.
Okay.
Carol.
Yeah, just to follow up on that last thing, yes, the RLECs are going to have to do work to get their calls in IP to the points of interface, but according to the FCC order, that's their responsibility and their cost to bear. So, and they have a timeline to do it. Could you go back to the 3-step slide? I think it's the next one. So the Public Utilities Commission is the 911 authority by virtue of the fact that we have regulatory authority over the network portion of the 911 call flow, but we don't have the authority to make network configuration decisions outside of a proceeding. This users group and the task force exist to advise the commission on these things. So what I would ask in order for us to negotiate location of IP POIs would be for CenturyLink to come up with a recommendation on where they think the POIs should be and bring it to a meeting of the ESInet users group. There's another one on Wednesday. The next regular meeting is on Wednesday. I recognize that might be too quick to turn around on this, but the one in September is September 10th. I don't know if that would be a reasonable date for CenturyLink to shoot for, to come up with recommendations. But I would like to see a recommendation on where CenturyLink thinks the POIs should be so that we can get some input from the ESInet users group members on that proposal, along with a timeline from CenturyLink on converting all of the OSPs over from the TDM interface to the IP POIs.
Yeah.
Do you think that's something that we could shoot for?
Yeah, we can, and there that is the exact Lumen process. That's why we have Paul had in the notes to negotiate the locations. We'll come back, looking at where the Lumen footprint is and make sure we got as much diversity and resiliency as possible. We'll provide some Lumen recommended locations, have some discussion about that. Now, here's what I will tell you from a Lumen perspective. What we're going to do is once you all submit the request, that's the notification that goes out to the OSPs that they have to do something. We'll send them follow-up notices, but we cannot force them to do anything, right? The FCC order is the guiding Bible, and like what Paul said, some of these guys may file for an extension. So, we'll do the same thing we do when we do a TDM migration. We'll have migrations meeting. We'll get a project manager assigned. We'll lay out a schedule, and then they should be moving their traffic. The beauty of it is once they start to move that traffic, it really will be transparent at the PSAP level, meaning there's nothing that needs to happen at the PSAP from a CPE configuration or testing. Is all done behind the curtains. So it really should be transparent to the PSAP phase 1.
Right.
But absolutely, we'll get some locations. We can maybe jump on the September meeting. And I think that should be ample time for us to come up with these locations. Because I'm assuming from what you said, you all want the POIs in state.
Well, I think that's a conversation to be had once you guys provide the proposals.
Okay.
I would like to hear argument. If CenturyLink wants to put one of the POIs outside of the state, I would like to hear the reasoning why and get input from the users group as to what they think about that.
We can definitely do that. And naturally, from a Lumen perspective, IP is IP. If I think in Colorado, we've got plenty of places where the RLECs can get to our network. So we'll give you all some locations. you can start socializing that information with the OSPs to get feedback from them, because those are the guys that really need to provide the feedback. I don't think it's going to be an issue, but I think involving them up front will give them some buy-in to the process and probably a lot less resistance and pushback on doing something.
Very good. And as far as the letter of authorization goes, I don't see any problem with that. My office is not really equipped to coordinate with 400 different OSPs, so we would like CenturyLink to do that for us.
Yeah, once you click on that link there and that notice goes out, that's the official notification to them. And like in step 3, we will get a project manager assigned to start working with the OSPs on the migration process. So we're not expecting the state of Colorado or the 911 authority to perform that task.
Yeah. And just FYI, we will not be filling out and submitting that form until we have a solid idea of where the POIs are going to be, and the
That's
ESInet users group is
exactly what has to happen. Yes.
Yeah.
You're declaring, by filling out this ballot request form, you're declaring your awareness and agreement of the IP POI locations.
Yeah. So there, you're spot on. So the intent is not to submit that form until we, Lumen, have provided you all some tentative locations for IP POIs. It has been socialized and we've kind of got bonded in. Once you all have agreed on those locations, then that's when you submit that letter, and that's what starts the notification and the clock ticking for the OSPs.
All right, very good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much. Good question. Anyone else before I move on?
Yeah, I'll just say, if there's perspective from the users group on the location of those POIs prior to getting Lumen's proposed locations, I'm happy to gather that information and just aggregate it all so we're prepared for the September meeting.
Yeah. Hey, and let me say this about that piece, right? Because I know the way the verbiage is in the order, it truly is a partnership between, Lumen, the BSP and the 911 authority. But here's what I'll say is, from a Lumen perspective, we view the network different than what an outside person looking in may see. So what I'll say to you is, when Lumen provides the recommendations, there's a couple of things we've taken into account. So number one, we've taken into account how much of resiliency and diversity we can provide, with POI A being location A and POI B being in location B. The one thing we don't want to do is, let's say if we're trying to accommodate this group of RLECs and we put both of the POIs in the same geography, you don't have that geographical diversity, which is a requirement. So let's just make sure that we're open-minded, that when Lumen comes back with some recommendations, it's going to take a couple of things into account when it says, here, these are the recommendations. And it could be 3 or 4 different locations. I'm not sure yet, but I just want, to kind of set the stage there, that when we come up with recommendations, we've taken geographical diversity in place, resiliency, all the things that's required to make sure that a 911 call can get through to the PSAP, but more importantly, also to make sure that we kind of try to alleviate any cracks in the network so we don't create a single point of failure. All right. So that would be my only ask is, when you look at them, just think there's been some logic or thought being put into it. And once we start socializing, if the OSPs have some recommendations, then we'll be more than happy to take those back and try to accommodate. And if it doesn't make sense, we'll say why.
Thank you, Steve.
All right.
What I also did here was wanted to show or provide an example what the request form looks like. And this is taken straight from the page. The beginning section of the valid request form. Basically showing that the 911 authority is certifying segments of their various agreements, they're aware, they agree with the locations, they're aware of the locations, and this information is going out, and it really, it doesn't take the pressure off the 911 authority. You know, they still want to be aware and work and coordinate with the various OSPs out here, but Lumen will also share in that discussion and provide support and to help communicate and coordinate this, that we don't leave the folks up there just high and dry. So that was the intent of this particular page here. This should match up with what you see in the ballot request form. And as you go through that ballot request form, if you haven't already, you're going to have an opportunity to state either a single PSAP, or I'm sorry, a single, PSAP, or you're representing all PSAPs within your authority or your jurisdiction. You'll have that opportunity, but I can't see you wanting to display or to fill out however many 60 some odd, however many OSPs are in the state, fill out a separate form. You can include that in one form, and that you're representing all PSAPs. Next, we have, come on, to Steve's other point that, again, up to this point, we're talking about just phase one. Phase two, from a 911 authority perspective, is essentially the same, where it will be incumbent upon you to file the request, a valid request form, and a new 6-month clock, not the same one, but a new 6-month clock will start up for phase two. Now, this phase two obviously deals with the Liz servers, pieces of equipment that are on the requirement of the OSPs once again. And then the BESP, as referred to by Colorado, is the core provider for NG911 services. Lumen, as the BESP, has been and is taking measures to ensure that phase two is compliant and meets the recommendations. That includes the Liz, that includes the LVF and other functions.
Yeah. Hey, and let me add to what Paul said, and this is the critical piece of the original intent of the order. So the original intent of the order is for 911 calls or next gen calls to be delivered I3 from end to end. So the whole reason for phase one is to migrate from TDM to IP, and the intent of phase two is for that call delivery to the PSAP to be I3. And if you look at the drawing that Paul has, is in the upper block, it's showing that call been delivered to the PSAP as a next generation I3 call. And at the bottom, it shows that we're delivering the call to the PSAP as an I3 call, but there's a piece of equipment as LPG, legacy PSAP gateway, that's kind of converting it back to a non-I3 called RFAI. The LPG is not the desired intent of the FCC order. I think they put that in there to allow entities to start budgeting to migrate their CPE equipment to I3. So I think that whole LPG, the intent of the order, that was an interim solution. And Rich Johnson, is Rich Johnson on the call? Not sure, but Rich Johnson from Entrado, we had a lot of conversation last Thursday about, you know, the FCC order, what the intent and the interpretation. And we truly believe that the intent of the order was to deliver an I3 call end to end. So that means at the PSAP, the CPE should be able to accept that call as an I3 call. But, you know, we can deliver it as an LPG, as an I2 call, but then it kind of defeats the purpose of requesting phase two if you're going to turn around and convert it back to an LPG at the PSAP. And I think we're going to have some further conversation on that in upcoming meetings. But yes, we can accommodate that. But I think it's the Lumen recommendation is if you start down the phase 2 request, that also, you know, the intent would be to deliver that call to the PSAP as an I3 call.
Thank you once again, Steve.
All right.
So that essentially wraps up the presentation. The following slide here is just the acronyms associated that you might see and have questions on. But other than that, that's basically my presentation. Are there any other questions?
Hey, Paul, let me go back and add one other thing. So I think the other thing is on the phase 2, it's the same step 1, step 2, step 3 process, except you start at the step 2 where you go to that link and then you request for the phase 2 delivery. And then, you know, we still would get a Lumen PM assigned to go through that same process, but you just won't do the step 1 once you get ready to request phase 2 deployment.
We got 2 hands up. Joe Becker.
Go ahead.
Phase 2 is delivery of PIDFlow, as I understand it. The location information is delivered in the call stream. And there was some question about whether the LPGs that are deployed in Colorado were prepared to handle that and convert from PIDFlow to the PSAP going out to the LPG and pulling the data as if it was pulling it from an E911 database.
The LPGs that we have deployed will accommodate. So if you decided to deploy phase 2 without the CPE being I3 compliant, that was the whole intent of the FCC order, putting that LPG in place to accommodate that. And the LPGs we have in the state will accommodate that. But once again, I'll say this, and Rich and I talked for 30 minutes about this. It kind of defeats the purpose, because if you're going to put that LPG in place, why even request the phase 2?
Well, the problem would be, and as I understand, you said that we would have to have all PSAPs ready to go to phase 2 before we could request it. And some of our rural 911 authorities may not have the funding to be I3 compliant for several years.
Okay.
Well, the Front Range authorities probably want it yesterday.
Okay. So you're saying it may be PSAPs out there that their CPE is ready for I3. And so for that reason, the state would request it. And for those that maybe don't have the funding right now, but are budgeting for it, then they could, because we can have a scenario where a PSAP is receiving a call via I3 and another PSAP isn't. So we can definitely accommodate that requirement. The thing that we didn't want to see happen is, from a state perspective, that there wasn't budgeting to upgrade that CPE to be I3 compliant, and therefore, you know, they limped along from an I2 perspective forever.
Yeah, the PSAPs are funded locally, and so there are some, especially in the smaller jurisdictions, less populated jurisdictions, that will be probably delayed in getting there. But do understand that even without an LPG, you can deliver some calls with PIDFlow and some not.
To the PSAPs, if there are some PSAPs that are I3 ready, we can deliver the calls to them via I3. Absolutely.
But if there's some that are not I3 ready and are not on an LPG, you can handle that as well?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Because I think in any event, there's going to be a period of time where we have, you know, carriers have, the local ones at least, have up to 12 months to comply. delivering it. And so we won't have all OSPs deploying at the same time. And also because, as I understand, you said that the CPE it doesn't have to be upgraded in many cases, but it does have to be, I forget the word you used on the last call, configured to take
Yes.
Pitaflow. And there are probably more PSAPs, for example, that have the Intrado Viper system than Intrado has technicians to come out and to simultaneously
Right.
do all the reconfigurations.
Yeah. And I think the key here is just about planning, right? Which is if I'm a PSAP and if your PSAP, let's say if they've done an upgrade in the past 2 or 3 years, then that PSAP is probably I3 ready, just may require some configuration, may need a piece of hardware here and there, but not a major overhaul to get that box ready for I3. And maybe even if it's a non-Intrado, and if you got boxes out there, systems out there that's, in the 5 or 6 year range, it may require a hardware refresh to get it to the point where it's I3 ready. So I'm not sure, but I think, if the state is definitely, once we get past the phase 1, want to go into the phase 2, then I think it's a good exercise to start planning and meeting with the CPE vendors, the PSAPs, to see what's required to get their equipment I3 compliant and ready. And I think even with this, there's still, I don't know if Tim Kunkelman is on the call, but we still have to make some modifications to the existing term, because I think we need to specify in there that from a BSP, we're going to be delivering that traffic via IP and not TDM. So those are the things there's a lot of moving parts, things that have to happen. But I think the first thing from a Lumen perspective of phase 1 is to start talking about where the ports are going to be located, get feedback, and then get that initial request going. And then I think once we get phase 1 going, then that natural evolution is to start the process for phase 2.
Hey, Steve, we've got 2 more hands up.
Okay.
Do you have something, Tim, to clarify with that?
Hey, we had Daryl.
Yes. So, yeah, Joe was correct. The reason why we need to have the LPGs is because the CPE purchases are completely a local decision, and we don't have any control from a statewide perspective as to when the local agencies upgrade their CPE or what CPE they purchase. But we want to support the PSAPs that already have CPE that are NG911 capable, which is why we would need legacy PSAP gateways. One thing I wanted to point out is that right now we have legacy PSAP gateways in place for those PSAPs that have CPE that aren't capable of receiving calls in SIP format. So a little over half of our PSAPs are receiving calls in direct SIP, and less than half are receiving calls through an LPG. Under phase 2, my understanding is you're going to need LPGs for 2 different kinds of scenarios. PSAPs that are able to get calls in SIP like they are now, but not with Pitaflow. They're not I3 capable, but they are SIP capable. So you may need to translate those calls into SIP for those PSAPs, as well as the PSAPs that are still on CPE that can only take calls in TDM, in which case you're going to have to do a more complete conversion from I3 to TDM. Is that something that your LPGs would be able to accommodate? Would you need 2 different kinds of LPGs in place for that? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think Doug Cunningham, are you still out there? Cunningham, Doug.
I'm here, Steve.
Go
Sorry,
ahead. Go ahead.
I've been listening on hands-free. Let me fix my audio.
Yeah, I'll let Doug answer that question. Daryl, he's the guru.
Do you mind restating the question, Daryl? I apologize.
Sure. So right now we have PSAPs that are on LPGs to receive calls in TDM because the way the ESInet is delivering calls is in SIP, but not all PSAPs are capable of receiving that in SIP. Once phase 2 is complete, there may be PSAPs that can get calls in SIP, like they can get calls in SIP now, but they're not I3 capable. So we may need two different kinds of LPG deployments, one to convert the I3 to SIP and one to convert I3 to TDM.
Yeah,
Is
I
your
understand. I understand. Thank you for
Okay.
restating. So the LPG, it consists in multiple devices, right? There's obviously the audio conversion that occurs to convert from IP back to gamma, but there's also usually a location device. A lot of times we standardize within IP to serial device, such as a Digi or IO LAN conversion, and we separate these functions out based on the standard. So you have something called a PIF, which is the protocol in working, which really does that major from IP to serial handoff or from IP to analog handoff. So those functions, even though we use a common term LPG, there are different physical elements that make up that component. So regardless of what the ingress provider, whether we're providing it as a full end-to-end I3 call, the function of that LPG is still to handle whatever those protocol conversions required at that PSAP are. So legacy PSAP supports direct SIP, basic SIP we'll call it 3261. That's fine. It'll still query through the LPG for a location delivery. There's some modifications that we have to do to make sure that the 10 digits are still being provided in the right format, but that is something that we've had to deploy in the past. So hopefully that provided a little bit of context around what the LPG does. Really, that LPG is there so that you can support any transitional call handling equipment or legacy equipment behind that and still have a core that delivers I3. So that's exactly the purpose.
Great. And I just want to
Excuse
point
me.
out for CenturyLink's planning purposes, there may be PSAPs that today do not have an LPG because they can take calls in SIP,
Mm-hmm.
but they may need an LPG after phase 2 because they can only take calls in SIP. They can't take calls in I3.
Fair enough.
I thought
Yeah.
Steve Deloach said that if there's a PSAP that gets it in IP and is not I3 ready, they could still deliver the call to them with the location not in PIDFlow. Did I misunderstand you, Steve?
No. So what I said is, so if a PSAP is receiving a call today, IP, what I've seen in most cases, it means that their CP is I3 ready. Now, what I said is, if they're receiving a call and not in SIP today, and we do phase 2, they would probably be able to accept that call as an I3 call. What Doug just said is, if for some reason, based on their scenario, that they can accept as a SIP but not an I3, that we can put an LPG there to convert that to them so they can receive the PIDFlow portion of it. Does that make sense, Joe?
So, Joe, to that point, to expand on Steve's thought process, the LPG is derived of not just different physical, but its standard writes it as the PIF, which is the protocol inner working, the NIF, which is the network inner working, and the LIF, which is the location inner working. And those don't necessarily occur all in that same device at the premises. It it can occur in the core as well. So the call that's delivered to that PSAP, it's doing that inner working for you and delivering a format that's able to be consumed by whatever the PSAP needs.
So to clarify, do we need to add LPGs to those PSAPs which are receiving an IP but are not I3 ready? Because you can do it at the network, at the inner working function at the network level, or do we need to add LPGs to those PSAPs?
I think it was Daryl that mentioned that there may be some that today are not currently able to derive location via I3 format that do not have an LPG currently today, but would still require one tomorrow. So I'm just going based on what was said in the meeting.
Yeah, you said a minute ago that some of the inner working functions can be provided at the network level rather than at the PSAP level, which I assume would need an
Yeah,
LPG.
it still needs that handoff, that serial to
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't exist today, it would be required to meet
Okay.
that legacy standard.
Yeah. And Joe, what we've seen is once we start the process in coordination, we will be having meetings with the CPE vendors. And then they at that time will say to us, hey, in order for us to accommodate that request, we're going to need something at the prim to do that conversion. Or they may say, hey, we need to talk with our customer, and there's another piece of software that they need to add, or hardware to do that conversion. So it, like Doug said, it's truly going to depend, and Daryl, what Daryl said, it's going to depend. And that's why it's critical that we bring all parties together once we start the process to make sure people understand the project, what the requirements are, so we can then determine what's needed from a Lumen perspective versus what's needed from a call handling vendor perspective.
I just wanted to clarify, and
Yeah.
I need to take over from Daryl.
No, that was a great question. And the one thing we do know is, unfortunate, when the FCC came out with this order, it was truly trying to accommodate one size fits all. But I think we've been in this business long enough to know that that doesn't exist in the public sector world.
Hey, Steve, Michael Berry's been very patient.
Hey. Okay. Hey, Michael.
Good afternoon. So an assigned project manager has been mentioned for both of these phases in your slides. Considering some of the other conversations around the state and notwithstanding like specific agency CPE changes, does CenturyLink consider these projects part of their tariff and included, or will there be a cost to the 911 authorities for those project management steps?
Yeah. So the way I can answer that, Michael, is I know product and regulatory are looking at what the Lumen requirements are going to be. So I don't know right now, but I'm pretty sure here shortly there's going to be some guidance on what that means and what we can and can't do based on language in the FCC order. So I'm not trying to evade your question. I just don't know the answer to that question right now. But I do know we're going to have some clarity here shortly.
Thank you.
I see Chris's hand. Hey, sorry.
Somebody
Chris?
else jump in? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Thanks.
All right, quick follow-up to that. Will there be one project manager for all PSAPs in the state, or will there be a project manager per 911 authority at the local level?
It'll be one for the state, and we'll probably have two assigned from Lumen that I think you all work closely with Tracy. She'll be part of that. And then we'll also have what we call an OSP coordinator that will be doing all the interface work to the OSPs, and they'll be kind of working hand in hand. But Tracy will have overall responsibility for the project, working in conjunction with the OSP coordinator.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you all very much for your time. Again, my name is Paul Brown.
Hold on, we have hands
Go
up
ahead,
still.
Andrew.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Let me jump in real quick, because one of the stated objectives of this meeting was to get an idea of timeline. And I have not heard anything about how long it's going to take to get to the point. Well, I heard conflicting information, so maybe you can clarify that Lumen CenturyLink is ready to receive phase one requests. Is that accurate?
So going back to the beginning of the discussion here, This really is regarding phase one. Phase one is about as an OSP, and Lumen is reviewing the network as an OSP to ensure that we're compliant and ready to move whenever the 911 authority files the valid request. Once that valid request is filed, that will start a 6-month, as we mentioned earlier, for Lumen's perspective, that will be a 6
Okay, let me before you go into that all again, sorry, let me clarify. I'm not worried about Lumen as an OSP. I'm worried about Lumen as our BESP and Intrado as our core services provider. So on slide 4, checkbox number 2 says that we as the PSAP have obtained commitments from our ESInet provider and our core services provider that they are ready and willing to, receive that information and deliver to us according to this FCC rule. So is Lumen and Intrado as our BESP and core services providers, respectively, are you all saying on this call that you are ready for us to start receiving those requests for the OSPs?
Yeah, let me take this. This is Steve. So from an Intrado perspective, they are ready for phase one. It's going to be transparent to them. From a Lumen perspective, as we mentioned earlier, once we get back to the state with the IP POI locations, and the users group has socialized that with the OSPs, when that is ready and check the box, then the clock starts and we will be ready to start the Lumen deployment process within that 6-month window. So once we identify where the IP POIs are going to be located and that step 1 request form is completed, then the clock starts and we all are on the same clock. So to answer your question, yes, Lumen is ready. Yes, Intrado is ready. What we have to do is that step 1 is identify the IP POI locations.
Okay, and you all are going to come back, probably not Wednesday, but next month with recommendations?
That is correct. That's the plan. We're going to socialize that. We know that's the ask, and we'll start socializing that then maybe for this September meeting to come back with some recommendations.
Okay, and then once we as a task force say, okay, we want POI 1 here and POI 2 here, whatever, what's the timeline for completion of that work?
Well, that's per the FCC order up to 6 months. But as Paul mentioned earlier, some of the OSPs may file for an extension, but it's 6 months from the time that request goes out. When you all click on that link to generate the request is when the clock starts for the 6 months.
So and again, this may be my confusion, so I apologize, Steve, but when we're talking about POI locations, to me, that's independent of the OSP requests, right? That is foundational work that has to be completed on the ESInet before we can implement phase 1. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, but I think the problem is, and we had this conversation as well, to send the notice out to the OSPs without clarification on where these POIs are, they can't start any work. Correct. So it's not fair to say, hey, we sent you a notice, the clock has started, and we haven't even told you where the IP POIs are located, so they can't provide any feedback. We think the reasonable process is to identify the POIs, get agreement on those, and then once that's done, submit the documentation, which could include where the IP POIs are going to be located, and they will have all the information they need to start building out the network. So it's really fair to them that the clock starts when they have all the information. Because if you submit the request and they get it, they're going to be requesting extensions because they're going to say, hey, we can't start to build the network out because we don't know where the POIs are.
Right. And so I just want to make sure that there's no intervening from when we say, here's where we want the POIs to be. It's not going to be, 3 months for Lumen to establish those POIs. Then we can.
Well, let's be careful there, right? If you tell us to build, POIs in the middle of, a cow field somewhere, then we're going to have timelines. Right. So, and I don't think that's your intent here. The reality is when we come back with recommendations, there are going to be network locations that are already on net for us. And if those are not viable for you, then it becomes an iterative process that we work through to figure out locations that work for both you and us. And that, I think that's where I was going with the conversation, or at least wanted to go with the conversation, is I heard differently that you were asking about the IP POI stand up. If these are locations that have diversity, they're already on net, that have physical capability to accept all of the OSP traffic, then it makes the process a lot easier. They're already enabled for us. It becomes order to a port, and that individual OSP is connect to them.
Okay, so we're talking days of work from once, as long as they're on net, we
Correct.
identify the location, so we're off to the races at that point.
Yeah. And just keep in mind that 6-month clock that we're talking about is applicable to Lumen as well, because we are an OSP also.
Right, I understand that.
Yeah,
I'm just talking about ESInet. Okay, so then
Yeah.
we've established the POIs, we've got that 6-month clock going for various OSPs one at a time. What is the timeline to get us ready for phase 2?
So, and I'm gonna answer it in this fashion. I think from a Lumen perspective, we've already started the engineering work on our side for the phase 2 in the list. So that piece is going. I know Paul is working on this with our A&E organization. Paul, do you have any idea when we're gonna have a plan that we can articulate and communicate and deploy? I know you've been working with A&E on this piece.
Correct. And the very simple answer is I'm not ready to articulate that or speculate where that would be ready to implement. So, but we are working on it.
Andrew,
We're actually working directly with our partner too in Toronto. So there's as Steve mentioned earlier too, there's a lot of moving parts. We want to make sure that that are being introduced in for phase 2, but we have been and continue to work on, and we do have a project assembled for this, and those folks are aware of what we need to do.
Yeah, and for the sake of not sounding schizophrenic, right? It's very crucial for us to understand which portion that we're speaking about, whether it's the BESP portion for phase 2 readiness or the ingress OSP side, right?
As I stated at the beginning of my
Yeah.
question, I'm just talking about BESP.
Yep.
Guys, this is the third time we've had this conversation, and I feel like I'm schizophrenic because the responses that we continue to get from Lumen are pedantic and circular. I am looking for some concrete information here, gentlemen, about what it's going to take to get Colorado ESInet to an I3 NG911 standpoint.
Yeah. Hey, so Andrew, I think it's the phase 2. What I will do is, from a regulatory perspective, we'll start sending out via Tracy some regular updates as we get information from the planning side on that phase 2. Because keep in mind, this phase 2 is a requirement that a lot of BSPs are trying to figure out how to do it and make sure it's done correctly. The OSP side, the phase 1 was kind of a no-brainer, but the phase 2 is the piece that requiring some lift on that piece. So I think, Paul, let's just make sure from a Tracy perspective, as we get updates, that we keep the Colorado community updated as well, because I can understand this FCC order has been around for almost a year, and it's really time to start moving on it. So, Paul, let's keep this top of mind. I know David Shearhart has been working on the final design pieces of it. Let's get a date that we can articulate that we're ready from a phase 2 perspective.
Andrew, to answer you directly for the core services, it is not a technology issue that exists today. There are things, as Steve mentioned earlier, that have to be added to the tariff to account for I3. So I think you're asking directly about the BESP and the NGCS core, because that's where you started this conversation. And that has nothing to do with any of the list stand-ups that Lumen needs to do as an OSP.
All right, I'm gonna.
Okay, thank you.
We're-
Any
We're over.
any other questions for Lumen?
Yeah.
Here, I'll jump in. I'm going to jump in. We're over time. We're over 5-6 minutes. I appreciate Andrew's passion on behalf of many of us who want better communication and transparent dates. It'd be great to add this to our monthly meeting. Tracy provide to the group with some more concrete dates and maybe a roadmap that is regularly communicated to the group. So we do have one more
Tracy's on
hand
the
up.
call.
I'm here, guys. I was gonna say, Stephen and Jennifer and Kathy, what if I just add this as a separate line item to the weekly tracker? That way, if I get weekly updates from Steve or Paul, I'll send them out. And by adding it to the tracker, we share this at our monthly meeting, so it's gonna be a topic anyway.
And please add phase 1 and phase 2 as separate items.
Okay. That is done.
Yep. Hey, and this is Steve. I will say this: what you all are asking isn't unreasonable. We probably should have been more transparent in providing updates on a more frequent basis. So that it was definitely a miss on Lumen's part, but we will make sure it's a part of all updates going forward once we have the Tracy meetings.
If I can, I just want to confirm that this phase 1 is not dependent on approval of the tariff filing that is pending that will include TDMS and protocol conversion and those types of services.
That is correct. Tim Kunkelman is working, but you are correct. So phase 1, right now, those are two separate things. What Kunkelman's working on with some updates to the tariff, this phase 1 stuff.
And will phase 2 be dependent on that?
That I don't know, because there is some incremental stuff uplift that's required. So I can't answer, but Tim is the one that will be taking all that into account and coming up with the response.
And also whether there will be another tariff filing for phase 2 that you might require. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. Tim is the man that's working all of that.
And again, under the FCC order, the OSPs, depending on the OSP, actually have either 6 months or 12 months to comply. The RLECs fall in the 12-month category, and we can do both phase 1 and phase 2 requests simultaneously, but phase 2 doesn't you don't
run in parallel.
Apply until they've met phase
until phase 1 timeline is done. Phase 2 does not kick in. It doesn't kick in at the same time as phase 1 application.
Right. And we couldn't do phase 2 unless you're at the point with phase 1, unless phase 1 is delayed long enough that you're ready for that, for phase 2, as I understand it.
Oh, in terms of petitions?
Yeah. As far as notification.
That's part of the negotiation between the OSP and the 911 authority. And generally speaking, that's what we try to do, is everybody wants to be successful with this. So this is a full front collaboration between the OSPs and the 911 authority, because what is, to Steve's earlier point also, this is trying to bring the state 911 authority more into an awareness of what's going on in the network to help them stay informed and understand how the network is performing and where everybody is successful, or we just need a little help somewhere.
Okay. And the last thing is, I am concerned about the RLECs being responsible for all the facilities if they have to go to another point. In most of Colorado, in the rural areas, CenturyLink is the provider. There aren't alternative providers or networks or paths available. And so if there's new construction, we've seen what the costs can be in the network improvement plan that we're funding. And that would be an issue for a lot of small RLECs if they have to bear those costs. But if there have to be alternative paths to get to a different POI, then we might as well deploy them as diverse routes for 911, because a lot of our rural areas don't have network diversity for the 911 network.
You bring up a very good point. And because diversity is a key component to having a reliable and resilient network.
Yeah. Hey, Joe, and I think that goes back to once we identify some potential locations and then they get socialized with the OSPs, then we can start having conversation about what's required. But as Doug says, if somebody needs a POI in this location, because I don't think the intent of the order was to have, 5 IP POIs in a geography, right? So, I mean, that there's just a lot of things that could come in that could impact the timelines and cost depending upon what the ask is. So I don't want us to get too premature. Let's get these locations. Let's start socializing them. Let's get the feedback, and then figure out how we address, everybody's concerns.
Steve, we got one more hand up, Matt.
Okay. Hey, Matt.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
You're right though that we need to include consideration of the OSPs as partners in all of this. And so for the Western Slope example, I would mention or urge you guys as you're thinking about POIs to recommend is locations, interconnection agreements, and so forth. For example, the Rural Independent Network Alliance. That's basically, it's a coalition of rural, small wireless cellular service providers. And, how are they going to be able to connect to these POIs from the western half of the state to either a POI over here or someplace else that's reasonable and feasible for them? RINA wireless.com would be a reference for them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Absolutely, Matt. Thank you, Matt.
All right, we're about
Anything else
on past the meeting. Is there any other final questions for CenturyLink? All right, nothing heard. Any other final comments from CenturyLink?
Not from my perspective. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak. Fully appreciate it. And as another important side note, hope everyone that's battling the Mother Nature in that area, I hope everyone's safe and keep up the good work. Thank you for everything that you all are doing.
All right, so just to wrap up, we've got multiple action items walking away from this meeting. The two most important are going to be transparent monthly reporting from Lumen through Tracy on the issue tracker that specifically has dates and roadmap that can be regularly communicated to the group. And then what we're looking for next is the POI location suggestions from CenturyLink that we can socialize prior to the September ESInet user group meeting, recognizing there's not a lot of time between now and Wednesday for this. If you have them, great. If not, get them to us so we can discuss it at the September meeting.
I would say that your September meeting is a better shot to set more realistic expectations.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Yeah. 2 days is a quick turnaround. I get it. Yeah. Jennifer, anything else that you want to make sure we cover?
I don't have anything else beyond a reminder that CenturyLink committed to providing this group a list of entities that are using an LPG so that we can specifically support them when it comes time to be phase 2, which is obviously a long way off.
Tracy, is that something you were tracking?
All right, guys, I had you on mute. We were not, but I can add that to it. So it's the entity supporting an LPG, and that would be by phase 2.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna need that as part of the phase 2 planning, but we are obviously not there yet, so
Well, we
just
need to know
keeping it on the
which
radar.
ones have LPGs and which ones don't have them, but will need them for phase 2.
I'm gonna add that to the same tracker if that's okay.
Sure, and Daryl's got his hand up.
I just wanted to point out that we do have a list from CenturyLink from last year that shows which PSAPs currently have LPGs. So there may not have been a lot of movement in that in the last 12 months. But yeah, getting that updated on an annual basis would be good, as well as what Joe just said. If any are going to need LPGs once phase 2 goes into place, I don't know that I don't know that that's an urgent request, but it's one that we will need before we consider phase 2.
Yeah, and building on what Daryl said, we do have that list, but there was some discussion at a previous meeting about whether or not that was accurate. So
It wasn't.
thank you. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't dreaming something up here.
You're correct. It
So
definitely needs a scrub.
yeah, thank you. That's all I had.
All right, thank
very
you
much.
everybody for the extra 17 minutes of your time today into your lunch hour, if that was your lunch hour. We'll see most of you on Wednesday.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Take care.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.